You think you know the story of Spartacus, the noble gladiator immortalized in the sands of the arena, the man who rose up against Rome to free all slaves? What if I told you that the most famous movie scene about him, the iconic cry of "I am Spartacus," never happened, and that his goal, almost certainly, wasn't to end slavery? The truth is much more complex, much more brutal, and frankly, much more impressive than the Hollywood myth. We've all felt trapped at some point. Chained to a system, a job, a situation that seems impossible to change. We feel the silent rage of injustice. Today's story is about the man who turned that rage into the fire that nearly consumed the world. But this wasn't the first time the chains had broken. As we explored in our two previous videos on the First and Second Servile Wars, the Roman Republic had already experienced the terror of slave armies in Sicily. That was a nightmare, but it was just a rehearsal. This was the Third Servile War of the main event, the one that took place in Italy itself. Today, we'll unearth the real man behind the legend, a military genius trained by the Romans themselves, who for 24 terrifying months led a rebellion that began with 70 men armed with kitchen knives and grew into a mobile nation of over 120,000 souls. A man who humiliated consular armies, shattered generals, and forced the most powerful republic on earth to stare into the abyss. If you're ready for the true, tragic, and epic story of Spartacus, join us. Subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave a like. Every click you make isn't just a sign of support. It's fuel that helps us continue spreading historical knowledge and combating myths. We want to know, from which city are you watching this epic journey? And what other figure, legend, or battle from history would you like to see demystified here? Leave your suggestion in the comments. In the year 680 since the city was founded, or 74 BC for us, Rome was not an empire. It was a creaking republic, an ancient political machine forced to govern a territory too vast for its own laws. Less than a decade earlier, the Eternal City had bathed in the blood of its own citizens. The dictatorship of Lucius Cornelius Sulla, with its dreaded prescriptions, had ended, but the scars remained. Sulla had tried to restore the old aristocratic order, the best, massacring his shores popular. He succeeded, but at the cost of shattering the republic itself. The precedent was set. Whoever had the most loyal legions held power. Stability was an illusion. Fear, a constant. While senators debated in the forum, ambitious generals like Pompey, Magnus, and Lucullus waged endless wars on distant borders. In Hispania against the rebellious Sertorius, and in the east against the ruthless Mithridates of Pontus. These wars, though distant, had an immediate and voracious consequence. They fed Rome's insatiable hunger for its most vital commodity, not gold, not grain, but human lives. This was the economy of Latifundia. Large rural estates, many of them confiscated during Sulla's prescriptions and given to his allies, dominated the Italian landscape. The small Roman farmer, the backbone of the ancient army, had been wiped out. In his place came the vocal instrument, the talking tool, as the theorist Vera would call them. Slaves, millions of them. The flow of captives from the wars in Gaul, Thrace, Greece, and Asia Minor had transformed Italy. Roman slavery was not based on race, but on misfortune. A captured soldier, a peasant in debt, a child born in a master's house, all were property. But in Latifundia, this slavery reached its most inhumane level. Working in chains from sunrise to sunset, sleeping in labor camp underground prisons, and branded like cattle, life expectancy was frighteningly short. Campania, the fertile region south of Rome, was the beating heart of this brutal economy. And nowhere was this brutality more refined, more spectacular, than in the city of Capua. Italy in 74 BC was a powder keg of resentment, oppression, and despair. Rome, distracted by its external wars and internal politics, ignored the fuse that was about to be lit under its own feet. If you've ever felt trapped in a system that seems unforgiving, know that this feeling is not new. And the story we're about to tell is about the most desperate attempt to break that system. If you value these deep journeys through history, consider leaving a like to help us continue bringing you these epic narratives. At the center of this impending hurricane was a man whose name would echo for millennia, though his true story is shrouded in mystery and propaganda: Spartacus. The Roman sources, our only accounts, are contradictory and hostile. were not interested in his biography. They were interested in portraying the enemy who nearly brought Rome to its knees. The historian Appian says he was a Thracian who had already fought as a soldier with the Romans. Plutarch, writing later, agrees, calling him a Thracian of nomadic origin and more Greek-cultured than barbarian. But another source, Florus, describes him more savagely, from soldier to deserter, from deserter to bandit, and then, in consideration of his strength, a gladiator. The likely truth lies in the conflation of these descriptions. Thrace, a region in the Balkans, was famous for its fierce warriors, often recruited by the Roman legions as auxiliary troops, non-citizen forces who did the dirty work on the borders. The most plausible theory is that Spartacus served as one of these auxiliaries. He learned Roman military organization, its tactics, its discipline, and crucially, its weaknesses, all from within the war machine itself. Why did he leave this service? Desertion is the Roman term. For a Thracian, it could be the end of a contract, a rebellion against an abusive commander, or a simple refusal to fight for his oppressors against his own people. Regardless of the cause, he became an enemy. Captured, he was not executed, but sold. His physical strength and military training made him too valuable to be wasted in a mine or latifundium. He had the perfect profile for a very specific and much more lucrative destination, the arena. This origin is crucial. Spartacus was not a slave born into captivity who knew no other life. He was most likely a free soldier, a man who knew tactics and leadership, who had experienced autonomy before having it all ripped from him. Plutarch makes a point of noting his intelligence and culture, suggesting that he was more than a brute. He was a man who understood the injustice of his position. Florus's account of him being a bandit may also contain a kernel of truth. After deserting, he may have led a guerrilla band in the Thracian mountains, fighting against Roman patrols, a form of resistance the Romans invariably labeled banditry. When he was finally chained and sent to Italy, he was not just a strong man. He was a seasoned veteran, a proven guerrilla leader, and a man with a deep and personal resentment against the power that had enslaved him. Rome, in its arrogance, failed to see the leader, saw only muscle to be sold. It was a miscalculation that would cost tens of thousands of Roman lives. The story of Spartacus is not just about steel and blood. It is tinged with the mysticism and fatalism of the ancient world. Plutarch himself, our most detailed guide, pauses his military narrative to record a supernatural event, a legend, as the topic itself suggests, without historical proof, but crucial to understanding the man's aura. It is said that when Spartacus was first taken to Rome to be sold, chained and exhausted, he fell asleep. As he slept, a serpent was seen coiled around his face. It was not a viper attacking. It was a guardian. The animal rested harmlessly on him, a powerful and disturbing omen for those who witnessed it. With him, legend has it, was his wife. She is not named. Her only identity is that of prophetess of her Thracian tribe, followers of the cult of Dionysus. For the Thracians, Dionysus was not just the god of wine. He was the god of ecstasy, liberation, the breaking of chains, and the primordial fury that overturned the established order. She, seeing the serpent on her husband's face, interpreted the sign. She declared it an omen of a great and terrible power that awaited him, but that, in the end, would bring him to a disastrous end. This prophecy perfectly encapsulates the tragedy of Spartacus. He was not destined to win, but he was destined to shake the world in his fall. Let's analyze what this legend, whether real or later fabricated, means. First, it humanizes Spartacus, giving him a partner who shares his captivity, a rarity in slave accounts. Second, it elevates him. The serpent, in ancient symbolism, was linked to divine protection, wisdom, and chthonic underworld power. It was not a sign of evil, but of an extraordinary destiny. Third, the connection to Dionysus is explosive. Slave revolts were not just about physical freedom. They were about the restoration of human dignity, by linking Spartacus to a cult of ecstasy and liberation. His wife, or the legend, transforms the coming rebellion from an act of desperation into a holy war, a Dionysian crusade against the oppressive order of Rome. This prophecy, whispered in a slave market or invented years later by his followers to explain their charismatic leader, looms large over his entire journey. It suggests that Spartacus was aware of his likely end. He fought not with the naive hope of victory, but with the fatalistic fury of a man who knew his freedom could only be bought with a cataclysm. He was the harbinger of a terrible power, and Rome would soon feel the weight of this prophecy. Spartacus's fate was sealed in Capua. This Campanian city was not just a luxury resort for the Roman elite. It was the capital of Rome's darkest industry, the gladiator trade. And at the heart of this trade was Thegame, the school of gladiators, by Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Batiatus. Being a trainer, a gladiator owner and trainer was to be a social outcast. It was a vile profession, trading the lives and deaths of human beings for entertainment. Yet, it was obscenely lucrative. Batiatus was one such man, a businessman who saw Spartacus not as a Thracian leader or a former soldier, but as a high-potential investment. Life no gamos, a hellish paradox. It was, undeniably, a prison. Gladiators were kept in cramped, locked cells. Discipline was maintained by overseers and trainers, the-doctors, often successful former gladiators who had won their freedom, who used the whip to enforce a relentless routine. However, unlike the anonymous slaves starving in Thelatofundius we saw earlier, gladiators were expensive investments. They were well-fed, receiving a diet rich in carbohydrates, the gladiatorial combat, or gladiator's fat designed to build a layer of fat over the muscles. This fat wasn't just for the appearance of strength. It protected nerves and organs from superficial cuts, allowing fights to be longer, bloodier, and more spectacular, without prematurely killing the active man. They received the best medical care the ancient world could offer. The training was scientific and brutal. Men were evaluated and categorized. Spartacus, with his size and likely military experience, would have been classified, perhaps as Amirmillo, a type of heavy gladiator with a large shield and sword, or, ironically, Athrex, the Thracian style, forced to fight as a caricature of their own people. They spent their days practicing with heavy wooden weapons, thrude, against the heptate and pole, perfecting their footwork, timing, and defense. They learned not just to fight, but to kill with style, to die well for the crowd. This routine created a complex psychology, game-fostered rivalry, but also a distorted brotherhood. The gladiator family, they were men on death row, but they were also celebrities. They were the dregs of society, yet desired by Roman matrons. Spartacus, with his intelligence and natural charisma, stood out. He wasn't just a prisoner, he became a leader within the prison. He watched, learned, and above all, waited. He was surrounded by the strongest, most dangerous, and most desperate men in the Republic, all trained by Rome to kill. Batiatus was, unknowingly, forging the leadership of his own nightmare. Before the first training sword was stolen, before the first guard fell, the end of this story was already written in Roman law. The punishment for a slave who raised his hand against his master, or worse, who took up arms against the Republic, was not a quick death in battle. It wasn't a vile punishment, the servile punishment, crucifixion. But what Marcus Licinius Crassus would do, years later, would transcend punishment. It would be a statement. 6,000 crosses, 6,000 men, former gladiators, former field slaves, shepherds, poor free men who had joined the cause, all nailed to wood. The Appian Way, the vital artery connecting Capua, the birthplace of the revolt, to the capital, Rome, became a 200-kilometer macabre gallery. Imagine the scene. The stench of death and bodily fluids mixed with the dust of Italy's busiest road. The sound wasn't silence. It was the buzzing of swarms of flies and the cawing of gorged crows. For travelers, merchants, and soldiers marching along the road, it was impossible to look away. Each cross was a physical, rotting reminder of what happened to those who defied the Roman order. This was not an act of thoughtless rage. It was a calculated act of state terrorism. Crassus, the architect of this revenge, didn't just kill men. He obliterated their humanity, denying them even the right to a burial. This vision is the specter that haunts Spartacus' every decision, every victory, and every defeat. This is the price of failure. When we look back at the brilliant victories to come, the ingenious tactics at Vesuvius, or the humiliation of consular armies, we must always remember that they fought under this shadow. They didn't just fight for freedom. They fought to escape this specific fate. Every Roman soldier they killed, every sword they captured, it was one more step away from the cross. This image is not the end of our story. It is its premise. It is what defines the stakes. For Rome, this was a war to restore order. For Spartacus and his followers, it was a war against this very future. A desperate struggle not to become a rotting warning on the main road to the Republic. The brutality of this final image is the driving force of the entire rebellion. It all began, not with a grand manifesto, but with a desperate whisper in the kitchen. Backed Hagamuf Lentulus Batiatus in Capua, the school of death we described, tensions had reached breaking point. Sources tell us that an initial plan involved some 200 gladiators, a number that suggests a widespread and well-organized conspiracy within the gladiator family. The life of a gladiator, though better fed than that of a field slave, was one of constant degradation, punctuated by the terror of the arena. They were men who had nothing to lose except a life that was already a death sentence. The conspiracy, however, leaked out. Batiato was informed. Time was up. The carefully crafted plan of 200 men was reduced to an act of pure improvisation. Spartacus, Crassus, and their closest leaders knew they would be punished, tortured, or immediately sent to the arena to die. They had to act now. The opportunity arose, as it often does in history, in the most mundane place. The revolt began not in the sword training arena, but in the kitchen. The conspirators, now reduced to a group of 70 to 78 men, stormed the dining hall and service areas. They had no weapons. They created them. They armed themselves with butcher knives, roasting spits true and kitchen axes cooks. They were peasant weapons, not soldiers' weapons. But in the hands of the best trained men in hand-to-hand combat in the world, they were lethal. They overpowered the guards of Thegamene, an explosion of chaotic and precise violence. The sound of kitchen steel clashing against Roman armor must have been Batiatus's first signal that he had lost control of his investment. The gladiators fought their way out of the fortified compound, bursting into the streets of Capua. They were a terrifying sight. Muscular giants, some perhaps still wearing parts of their training armor covered in blood and armed with blood-stained household utensils. But luck, or fate, intervened decisively. In the streets, they encountered a convoy, a wagon carrying a fresh shipment of gladiatorial weapons, shields, swords, and tridents, probably for another school or for the next games. They seized the wagon. The symbolism was perfect. They discarded their kitchen implements, the tools of their enslavement, and took up the weapons of their profession. They were no longer just runaway slaves. They were a gladiatorial warband. They fled Capua, the richest city in Campania, and stopped at nothing to find the perfect defensible terrain to turn their desperate escape into all-out war: Mount Vesuvius. The choice of Mount Vesuvius was no accident. It was ideal terrain for guerrilla warfare. At that time, in 73 BC, Vesuvius was not seen as the devastating volcano that would later bury Pompey. It was a high, fertile mountain covered in dense forests and, crucially, wild vines that grew abundantly on its slopes. At the summit was a wide depression, an ancient crater that formed a nearly impenetrable natural fortress. Most importantly, the main access to the summit was a single steep and narrow path, easily defended against an army attempting to ascend. For Spartacus, the former Roman auxiliary, the strategic value was obvious: high ground, a clear view of Campania below, resources, water and food from the vineyards, and a defensive choke point. It was here, in this volcanic refuge, that the warband became an army and a society. The first order of business was leadership. The rebellion was not homogeneous. The gladiators came from all over the world conquered by Rome. There were Thracians, like Spartacus. There was a large contingent of Gauls and Germans. This diversity was their strength, and, as history would prove, their greatest weakness. The initial leadership reflected this coalition. 3 men were elected or simply assumed command: Spartacus, Crassus, and Enemaus. Spartacus, the Thracian, is described by the sources as the strategic brain, the tactician, the man with the long-term vision. He understood the Roman war machine and knew that brute force alone would not be enough. At his side was Crassus, a Gaul, described as a fierce and perhaps more impetuous warrior. He represented the Gallic faction, which many historians believe was more interested in slave war, a war of revenge and plunder against their former Roman masters in the heart of Italy. The third leader, Enemaus, also a Gaul or German, is a more shadowy figure, often overshadowed by the other two, but clearly vital in the early stages, a field commander who would fall in battle relatively early on. This tripartite leadership wasn't just military, it was political. Spartacus had to balance different factions and objectives. While he could see the need for discipline, training, and a strategic goal, perhaps escaping Italy. Others, like Crassus, may have been driven by a more immediate anger. At Vesuvius, they began the work of transforming a desperate band into something resembling an army, while reconnaissance raids descended the mountain to plunder the wealthy villas of Campania, bringing back food, supplies, and, most importantly, more recruits. Each slave of latifundium who escaped and climbed the mountain brought with him his broken chains and a deep hatred for Rome. In Rome, news of the escape from Capua and the camp on Vesuvius was greeted not with panic, but with contempt. The Senate, as we have seen, was preoccupied with far more serious matters. Pompey was mired in Hispania, fighting the brilliant renegade general Sertorius. Lucullus was in the east, preparing for war against the powerful Mithridates VI of Pontus. These are wars waged against Roman kings and generals. What was happening in Campania was, at best, a robbery, banditry, or uproar, a civil disturbance. It was a problem for the police, not the legions. Calling it war would be to give undue dignity to slaves. This miscalculation, born of pure social and political arrogance, would be Spartacus's greatest initial asset. The Senate did not dispatch a consul or a hardened legion. Instead, it tasked a praetor, Gaius Claudius Glaber, with solving the problem. Glaber was not a career general. He was a politician whose main concern was likely to resolve this mess quickly, so as not to damage his reputation. He was not given legions, but rather a militia corps. Sources indicate that he mustered around 3,000 men. These were not the professional legionaries who had conquered the world. They were recruit soldiers, troops hastily recruited from the region, probably poorly trained, poorly equipped, and certainly poorly motivated to fight gladiators. Glabro's strategy reflected this arrogance. He marched his army to the foot of Vesuvius and found the only route to the summit blocked by rebels. Rather than attempt a direct and risky assault, Glabro decided on a siege. His logic was simple. The slaves had no supply lines. He controlled the only way down. All he had to do was wait. He camped his men at the blockade, at the base of the path, and waited for starvation to do the work for him. He didn't establish a full palisade around the mountain, nor did he send scouts to the other slopes. Why would he? The other side of the mountain was a wall of steep cliffs and impassable terrain. It was, in his mind, impossible to descend. Glabro sat, confident that the problem would resolve itself, while at the top of the mountain, Spartacus looked down at the Roman camp and saw not a siege, but an opportunity. Glabro's arrogance had created the perfect trap for himself. Claudius Glabro's plan was sound, based on all Roman military assumptions. Hunger was as good a weapon as the sword, but he was facing an enemy who did not operate by Roman rules. Spartacus, looking down from the summit of Vesuvius, saw what Glaber did not, a path where there was no path. The slope the Romans considered impassable was covered in a vital resource, wild, thick, and strong vines. It was here that Spartacus's tactical genius, his ability to think outside the box of conventional warfare, first shone. He gave an order that must have seemed mad: harvest the vines and weave them into long, sturdy ropes and ladders. This is one of those stories, like The Prophetess Wife, that sounds like legend, but is recounted by serious historians like Plutarch and Frontinus. It is entirely plausible. Under cover of darkness, Spartacus put his plan into action, while a small force remained at the summit to keep the fires burning and give the impression that the rebel camp was asleep. The bulk of his force, including himself, moved to the edge of the cliff. One by one, in absolute silence, the men descended the makeshift vine ladders. This was not a task for the faint of heart. It was a descent of hundreds of meters over treacherous terrain in the dark, with only braided vines preventing a fatal fall. It was the gladiators, the Thracian mountaineers, the shepherds accustomed to difficult terrain, who led the way. They landed at the base of the mountain, completely unnoticed. Glabro's camp had no sentries facing the cliff. Why would they? The danger was up there. Spartacus's army skirted the base of the mountain and fell upon the Roman camp from the rear, probably at dawn, when vigilance was at its lowest. What followed was not a battle, it was a massacre. The Roman militias, taken completely by surprise, many still asleep, were massacred. Glabro may have escaped, but his army was annihilated. The equipment, weapons, armor, and supplies of 3,000 Roman soldiers were now in the hands of the rebels. This victory was the true baptism of fire of the revolt. It transformed Spartacus's army, provided them with suitable Roman weapons, and, most importantly, sent a shockwave through Campania. The gladiatorial band on Vesuvius had destroyed a Roman force. The impossible had happened. The victory over Claudius Glaberus was the spark that lit the prairie. News of the Roman disaster, the annihilation of 3,000 soldiers by a band of slaves descending from a cliff, spread like wildfire across the vast expanses. Latofundi of Campania. For Rome, it was a shocking humiliation. For the millions of slaves who toiled under the lash, it was a call to arms. Vesuvius was no longer a prison. It had become a beacon of freedom. And they came. They came by the thousands. Men, and undoubtedly women, abandoned their tools in the fields, killed their overseers, and took what they could carry. They were tough-armed slaves, the rural slaves, the lowest rung of Roman society, men who had nothing but their chains. But they weren't the only ones. Shepherds and flocks from the region, free but impoverished men who lived a marginal life in the mountains and hated the aristocratic landowners, also joined the cause. This massive influx changed the nature of the revolt. The corps of 70 elite gladiators was now in command of an army that quickly grew to 10,000, then 20,000, and would continue to grow. With this growth came to immediate challenges. The first, equipment. The victory over Glaberus provided the first Roman weapons and armor, but not enough for everyone. Spartacus, the pragmatist, established forges in the camp. He ordered that all gold and silver looted from the villages be used solely to purchase iron. The rebels began to manufacture their own weapons, transforming agricultural tools into spears and shields. The second challenge was discipline. Spartacus now led a mob driven by rage. He had to transform this mob into an army. He used his auxiliary Roman knowledge to train them, organizing them into cohorts and teaching them to fight not as individuals but as a unit. He imposed an equitable division of all loot, a radical measure that maintained cohesion. The seed of rebellion became a forest. What began with kitchen knives was now an army that made Rome tremble. It's incredible how arrogance can blind power, a lesson history repeats over and over. If you're fascinated by how this small spark became a fire that consumed Italy, don't forget to subscribe and activate the bell, because the journey is just beginning. And we want to know, what other historical figure who defied an empire against all odds would you like to see here? Comment below and also tell us which city you're watching from. Your engagement helps us bring this knowledge to more people and build this community of history lovers. The victory over Claudius Glaberus was only the beginning. It was the victory over Publius Varinius and his legates that solidified the challenge. Spartacus's army, now swollen to over 40,000 souls, was a sea of hungry, furious humanity. But Spartacus, the former Roman auxiliary, knew a dark truth. He wasn't leading an army, he was leading a mob. A mob he had won through surprise and Roman incompetence. This wouldn't last. The royal legions were coming. The real challenge wasn't defeating militias. It was transforming a horde of field slaves, shepherds, and gladiators into something that could facie a legion. The first step, arm them. The weapons captured from Glabro and Varinius were valuable, but insufficient for tens of thousands. It was here that Spartacus's genius shifted from tactics to logistics. He began organizing the camp in a way the Romans would have recognized. He identified artisans among the runaway slaves, blacksmiths, carpenters, tanners, and put them to work. Forges were built. The sound of hammer on anvil became as constant as weapons training. And then, he gave the order that defined the character of his leadership. Plutarch reports that Spartacus forbade anyone in the camp to possess gold or silver. This was not an ideological statement. It was a brutal, strategic necessity. Gold was dead weight. Silver could not stop a Roman blade. He declared that the only trade permitted would be for iron and bronze. Merchants who dared approach the rebel camp were paid with luxurious loot in exchange for raw metal. The army became a makeshift war industry. Slave chains were melted down and reforged, transformed from symbols of oppression into swords, short swords. Agricultural tools, sickles and billhooks, were straightened and sharpened, becoming deadly spearheads. Oval shields were made of wood and leather, imitating legionary equipment. What could not be manufactured was adapted. At the same time, training began. The gladiators, their familiar originally from Capua, became their officers, their sergeants. They took the farm slaves, who had never held anything but a hoe, and taught them to march in formation, to hold a line of shields, to trust the man at their side. Spartacus was trying to recreate Roman discipline in an army whose very nature was anti-Roman. It was a logistical miracle, forged in fire and necessity, turning desperation into steel. Claudius Glaber's defeat at Vesuvius finally made Rome frown. That disturbance in Campania was more serious than anyone had imagined, but Roman arrogance still clung to a thick veil. The Senate, still focused on the real wars abroad, sent another praetor, Publius Varinius, the region's senior magistrate. This time they gave him more men and a clear mission to put an end to it. Varinius, a politician, not an experienced general, made the classic tactical error of dividing his forces to try to encircle an enemy he still considered inferior. He sent his two legates lieutenants, Furius and Caecinius, on separate maneuvers. Spartacus, now in command of a growing and mobile army, didn't wait to be surrounded. He hunted the Romans down. He first turned against Furius, who commanded some 3,000 men. Spartacus, using his superior mobility and the growing morale of his troops now partially armed with Roman equipment, attacked Furius with full force. The Roman militia, once again, broke and fled. The second part of Varinius's plan was now dangerously exposed. The second legate, Caecinius, was next. Plutarch tells us a vivid, though perhaps embellished, story that Caecinius nearly captured Spartacus in a moment of vulnerability, while the rebel leader was bathing. Spartacus barely escaped, but the near capture ignited his fury. He immediately regrouped, led a fierce counterattack, pursued Caecinius, raided his camp, and killed him in the midst of battle. The escalation was dramatic. The rebels were no longer simply defeating militias. They had killed a Roman legate, a direct representative of the Senate's authority. Varinius himself, having lost his two lieutenants, finally rallied his remaining forces and confronted Spartacus. The battle was another decisive victory for the rebels. Varinius's army was scattered, and in the aftermath of the battle, Spartacus captured the most potent symbols of Roman power. The lictors, bodyguards of Varinius, were killed, and his bendels, the bundle of rods and the axe that symbolized a magistrate's right to punish and execute, were taken. Varinius's personal horse was also captured. A runaway slave now possessed the symbol of Roman authority and rode a praetor's horse. The news swept Italy. The name Spartacus became synonymous with terror in Rome and hope in Thelabor camp. The rebel army, now perhaps 70,000 strong, was the undisputed master of southern Italy. In the winter of 73 to 72 BC, Spartacus was at the height of his power. He had humbled 4 Roman commanders, and his army was now a mobile nation of over 70,000 souls. With power came a crisis of purpose. What exactly were they striving to achieve? This is where historical sources become murky, and legend begins to compete with fact. Spartacus's true purpose is the greatest unresolved debate in history. The modern version, immortalized by literature and film, paints Spartacus as a social revolutionary, a man who sought to abolish society itself, institution of slavery. This interpretation, while romantically powerful, is almost certainly anachronistic. The concept of universal abolition did not exist in the ancient world. There is no evidence that Spartacus intended to overthrow the Roman social order. He simply wanted to be free of it. In fact, accounts suggest that his own army captured and held slaves. A second, more terrifying possibility for Rome was to march on the city itself. Appian suggests that Spartacus considered marching on Rome, a plan that would have been the ultimate revenge. But he did not yet consider himself a match for Roman power, for his army, though vast, lacked the siege equipment and discipline of royal legions. He knew that a multitude, no matter how large, would break against the walls of Rome and his household troops. Marching on Rome was a fever dream, not a viable military strategy. The third option, and the most plausible one supported by Plutarch and Appian, was simply to go home. The rebel army was a coalition of Thracians, Gauls, Germans, and others. Spartacus's plan, the most logical and militarily sensible, was to march his people north, cross the Alpine barrier, and once outside Italy, let each group disperse back to their homelands. He didn't want to conquer Rome. He wanted to escape it. But this pragmatic plan faced an insurmountable obstacle: success itself. The army was now flush with easy victories over praetors and militias. They had sacked the richest villages in Campania. Many, particularly the Gauls and Germans, refused to flee. They wanted more plunder and more revenge. Spartacus's army was not a cohesive military unit. It was a fragile alliance of conflicting goals. Spartacus was the strategic mastermind who saw the trap, but he led a body driven by pure rage. The debate over the war's objective did not remain theoretical. In the spring of 72 BC, it exploded into an open fracture that would change the course of the war. Rome, finally waking up to the scale of the threat, had mobilized its full force. For the first time, they did not send praetors or militias. They sent consuls. Both consuls elected for that year, Lucius Gellius Publicola and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianes, were tasked with crushing the rebellion. Consular legions, the true hardened legions of Rome, were marching. For Spartacus, the former soldier, time was up. The winter of training and organization was over. It was time to execute his escape plan. March north toward the Alps before these two new armies could corner him. He gave the order to march. And Crassus, his second-in-command, the proud Gallic warrior, refused. Crassus was the embodiment of the faction that had tasted blood. He had participated in the destruction of the forces of Glaber, Furius, Cassinius, and Verinius. In his view, the Romans were weak. Italy was there for the taking. Leaving now, when they were at the height of their power, seemed cowardly. The sources indicate that he, arrogant with success, saw no need to flee. He wanted to stay in southern Italy, continue his plundering, and perhaps even dreamed of marching on Rome. The army broke up. Spartacus, maintaining discipline over the bulk of the forces, probably mostly Thracians and other groups, began the long march north. Crassus, taking with him a substantial contingent of Gauls and Germans, sources vary, but Plutarch suggests 30,000 men separated and remained in Apulia in the region of Monte Gargano. This was the first split, a catastrophic tactical error born of pride and divided goals. The rebel army's greatest strength was its numbers and unity. Divided, they were but two smaller targets. Spartacus must have known the danger. He may have pleaded with Crassus to maintain unity, but the coalition he had so carefully built was crumbling under the weight of his own success. Crassus and his 30,000 men were now alone, and the legions of a Roman consul were marching straight toward them. Crassus's independence was short and bloody. While Spartacus led his army north, the consul Lucius Gellius Publicola marched his legions south, straight into Apulia. He found Crassus's army encamped near Mount Gargano, a position that, though defensible, became a trap. Crassus, unlike Spartacus, seemed to prefer brute force to subtle tactics. He was not a guerrilla. He was a warrior who craved a pitched battle, and Gellius gave him one. The ensuing battle was no skirmish. It was the first major confrontation between a rebel army and Rome's consular legions in full force. The difference in discipline and command was immediately apparent. Crassus's Gauls and Germans fought with fierce courage, an individual fury that made them fearsome opponents. Crassus himself, it is said, fought like a lion on the front lines. But individual fury is no match for the collective discipline of a Roman legion. Gellius's legions maintained their formation. They absorbed the Gallic charge on their shields, stabbed methodically beneath the shield wall, and used their cavalry to flank the less organized rebel army. Crassus's army was not just defeated, it was annihilated. The sources report carnage. Appian claims 30,000 rebels died, though ancient figures are notoriously inflated. Plutarch claims Crassus and 2/3 of his army were killed. Crassus himself fell in battle, dying like the warrior he was. This victory was a tonic for Roman morale. The Senate celebrated. One of the rebel leaders was dead, and a large portion of their army destroyed. The consul Gellius, proud of his victory, now turned north to hunt the main prize, Spartacus. The news of Crassus's death must have hit Spartacus in two ways. First, as a personal blow despite their differences. Crassus had been his companion since the escape from Capua. Second, as a strategic disaster. He no longer had an ally or rival to the south. He had a victorious consular army hot on his trail. And to make matters worse, the second consul, Lentulus, was ahead of him, blocking the route to the Alps. Crassus's split had not only led to his death, but had created the perfect trap for Spartacus. News of the annihilation of Crassus and his army at Mount Gargano echoed through Spartacus's camp. The first great split had resulted in the disaster he feared. The consul, Gellius Publicola, was now victorious and hot on his trail. Further north, the other consul, Lentulus, blocked his path. Spartacus was trapped between two consular forces. His reaction to Crassus's death was not despair, but cold, ceremonial fury. He needed to do three things: honor his fallen comrade, remind Rome that he was more than a runaway slave, and, most importantly, consolidate his control over his own, now shattered army. He did all three with a single act of brutal spectacle. He selected 300, some sources say 400, of the strongest and noblest Roman prisoners his army had captured in previous raids. He then announced that he would carry out gifts, funeral games in honor of the fallen Gallic gladiator Crassus. This was perhaps the darkest irony of the entire war. Thieves' gladiator fights originated in Rome as a blood ritual to honor the aristocratic dead. Now, the former gladiator was adopting the custom of his masters, but grotesquely reversing the roles. The lords of Rome, the citizens who once sat in the stands and cried out for blood, would now be the sacrifice. In an open field, surrounded by tens of thousands of slaves and rebels who formed a human arena, the 300 Roman prisoners were given weapons. They were forced to fight to the death in duels, to the savage delight of the army that had once been their property. This act was not mere cruelty, it was psychological theater. For his men, it was catharsis. It was the final reversal of the world order. They, who had been forced to fight for Roman entertainment, now watched their masters die for the same sport. It was a declaration that they were no longer slaves, but a people with their own rights and their own power. For Rome, news of this event was an existential horror. It was not just a military defeat, it was a desecration. The barbarians were not just winning, they were mocking the foundations of Roman culture. Spartacus, the man Plutarch called more Greek-cultured than barbarian, showed here that he was willing to use Rome's cruelest tools against it. With Roman blood still soaking the ground, the games ended. Crassus was avenged. Morale was restored. Spartacus then turned north to face the two consular legions hunting him. The funeral games had served their purpose. The army was unified again, hardened by revenge and focused on the leader who had led them there. But the strategic situation was dire. Consul Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus was blocking the northern passage through the Apennines. Coming from the south, marching swiftly after his victory over Crassus, was Consul Lucius Gellius Publicola. It was a classic Roman pincer maneuver. Spartacus was trapped between two full consular armies. For any Roman general, the war was effectively over. But Spartacus was no ordinary Roman general. He understood his opponent's weakness, their consular arrogance, and their rivalry. Each consul wanted the glory of crushing the revolt for himself. They failed to coordinate their attack. Spartacus used speed as his primary weapon. Rather than wait to be overwhelmed, he chose his opponent. He marched north at top speed and attacked Lentulus' army first. Lentulus, who believed he was blocking a band of retreating slaves, was shocked to find himself attacked by a disciplined and aggressive army. Spartacus used his cavalry, now substantial, captured from the Romans, to flank the legions, while his battle-hardened infantry center advanced. Lentulus' legions, taken by surprise and perhaps underestimating the enemy they had been sent to punish, broke. The retreat turned into a chaotic rout. Spartacus destroyed the first consular army. But there was no time to celebrate. Gellius's army, racing north to support their comrade or perhaps to steal his glory, was approaching. Spartacus did not retreat. He turned. With a speed that shocked the Roman commanders, he marched his victorious army south and encountered Gellius. Gellius's army, perhaps inflated by the confidence of their easy victory over Crassus, encountered an entirely different opponent. They did not face Crassus's undisciplined Gallic horde. They faced Spartacus's veteran army, fresh from the destruction of another consul. The second battle was as decisive as the first. Gellius's legions were also broken and put to flight. In a matter of days, perhaps weeks, Spartacus had done the unthinkable. He had encountered and defeated in succession Rome's two main armies, led by its most senior magistrates. The news that reached Rome was no longer of a disturbance. It was of an existential disaster. Italy was defenseless. After the humiliation of the two consuls, panic gripped Rome. The consular legions, Italy's main defense, were in tatters and retreating in disarray. Spartacus's army, now victorious and superbly equipped with the finest weapons and armor captured from fallen legionaries, continued its relentless march north. Their objective was finally within reach. They had crossed the Apennines and now entered Cisalpine Gaul, the vast fertile plain of northern Italy, today's Po Valley region. The next geographical obstacle was the Alps, and with them, freedom. But Rome had one last line of defense. The governor of Cisalpine Gaul, Gaius Cassius Longinus, who, ironically, would become famous decades later as one of Julius Caesar's assassins, would not stand idly by while an army of slaves marched through his province. Longinus gathered the forces at his disposal, probably 2 legions, and marched to intercept Spartacus near the city of Mutina, modern-day Modena. He intended to be Rome's savior, the man who succeeded where the consuls had failed. Confidence was high. He was defending his own territory against an enemy exhausted by the long march. The Battle of Mutina was the culmination of Spartacus's northern campaign. The rebel army, now moving with the confidence of an invincible force, did not hesitate. They did not try to bypass Longinus. They attacked him head-on. What ensued was a repeat of the battles against the consuls, but even more decisive. Spartacus's army, now a veteran war machine, crushed Longinus's legions. The sources report that the Romans were so thoroughly defeated that the governor himself, Gaius Cassius Longinus, had to flee the battlefield, barely escaping with his life as his men were slaughtered. The significance of this victory cannot be understated. It was the 3rd major Roman military defeat in as many months. Spartacus's army had defeated 2 consuls and a provincial governor. Italy was effectively open. More importantly, strategically, the road to the Alps was clear. There were no longer any Roman legions between Spartacus and the border. His original plan, as recounted by Plutarch, was complete. He could have led his people through the mountain passes, back to Gaul, Thrace, and Germania, and disappeared from Roman history. He had won. Against all odds, the Gladiator of Capua had defeated the Republic. Freedom was just a few days' march away. This is the most incomprehensible and tragic moment in the entire saga. At the height of triumph, with the Roman legions broken and the Alps, the gateway to freedom open before him, Spartacus paused. And then he turned. The 120,000-strong army turned and began marching south, back into the heart of Italy, back into the peninsula's trap. Why? History gives us no clear answer, only conflicting theories. This is the point at which Spartacus's strategic genius seems to collide with the will of the masses he led. The most common and plausible explanation comes from Plutarch. He writes that Spartacus himself wanted to cross the Alps, but his men, proud and full of confidence in their strength, refused. They no longer saw escape as a worthy goal. They had humiliated Rome 3 times. They had sacked its richest cities. They saw themselves as conquerors, not fugitives. They wanted more. The historian Appian offers a variation suggesting that Spartacus in his mind, deciding that marching on Rome was now a possibility. He reportedly said, after considering the idea, he realized that he was still no match for Rome. This theory suggests that Spartacus was momentarily blinded by success, before realizing that while he could defeat legions in open field, he lacked the siege equipment, logistics, or training to take a fortified city like Rome. Other historians suggest that the internal division that had already cost Crassus's life was to blame. The Gallic and Germanic faction, driven by revenge and a thirst for plunder, simply had no interest in crossing the mountains. They wanted to continue the war in Italy. Spartacus, the charismatic leader, became a prisoner of his own success. He could not force 120,000 men to go where they did not want to go. His army had become too large, too unwieldy, and now too arrogant to be controlled. Whatever the truth, be it his men's refusal, a change in strategy, or an internal division, the decision was fatal. By turning south, Spartacus was no longer dictating the terms of the war. He was giving up the strategic initiative and marching back into territory Rome would never give up. He was foregoing the chance for a final victory for freedom, and instead choosing a war of attrition he could not win. The decision to turn south months earlier, the refusal to cross the Alps, all culminated in this final moment. The Battle of the Silurius River, 71 BC. The war was lost. Spartacus's army, pinned against the river, was being systematically slaughtered by the disciplined legions of Marcus Licinius Crassus. The rebel line was breaking. The sound was an inferno of steel, screams, and the blaring of Roman trumpets. Spartacus, fighting on the front line as he always had, knew the end had come. He was no longer a general. He was a warrior in his last battle. And he would not die a runaway slave being hunted. He would die a soldier searching for the enemy commander. His men, seeing the disaster, brought him his horse, urging him to flee, to save himself so the fight could continue another day. Spartacus looked at his horse and then at the battle. He knew there would be no other day. It was then that he made the gesture that would define his legend. According to Plutarch, he drew his sword, but instead of mounting, he killed his own horse. As the animal fell, he reportedly shouted to his men, "If I am victorious, I will have many horses, those of the enemy. If I am defeated, I will need none." It was a declaration that there would be no retreat. The only way out was through the Roman line. He was burning his last bridge. He threw away his shield, grabbed his sword, and charged forward on foot. He became a force of nature, a personification of the rebellion's fury. His target was visible in the distance, surrounded by bodyguards. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the architect of his destruction. Spartacus led a desperate charge, not to win the battle, but to kill the Roman general. He cut his way through legionaries, killing 2 centurions who tried to stop him. He was wounded. A spear struck his thigh, forcing him to his knees. It did not stop. Kneeling, he continued fighting, using his shield for protection, until finally the wave of legionaries surrounded him. He was stabbed by dozens of spears and swords, disappearing under a mound of Roman steel and bodies. He died without ever reaching his target, but he died like a king, on his own terms. The news of Spartacus's about-face, followed by the humiliation of 2 consular armies and the defeat of a provincial governor at Mutina, plunged Rome into a state of panic not seen since Hannibal's invasion more than a century earlier. The Republic was naked. A former slave army, now 120,000 strong, marched at will across Italy, and there were no more legions in the way. The enemy they had dismissed as a police problem was now at the door, and stories of his victories and of his revenge at the funeral games terrified the populace. The Senate met in despair. The consuls of 72 BC, Gellius and Lentulus, had failed so spectacularly that they were removed from command. The problem of Spartacus had become Spartacus war. In this power vacuum, one man stepped forward, Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus was no military hero. He was not his great rival Pompey the Great, who was in Hispania gaining glory. Crassus was, above all, the richest man in Rome, a financier and real estate speculator who had built a colossal fortune from the ashes of Sulla's prescriptions, buying confiscated properties for pennies. But more than money, Crassus craved ... dignitas, prestige and imperium military authority. He saw the consul's failure as his golden opportunity. He offered the Senate to take command of the war. He would not only accept the command, he would finance it. The Senate, out of options and desperate, accepted. Crassus was not given a standard consular command. He was given imperium picial as a praetor, but with the authority of a consul and the right to raise an army, and he did. He didn't raise 2 legions, nor 4. Crassus raised 6 new legions, and took command of the 2 defeated consular legions of Gellius and Lentulus, bringing the total force to 8 legions over 40,000 men. It was a massive war force, paid largely from Crate's own pocket, for a single mission, to destroy Spartacus at any cost. Crassus knew this was his only chance to equal Pompey's glory. He wasn't fighting just for the Republic. He was fighting for his legacy, and he would bring the full weight of his wealth and ruthless ambition to this fight. Crassus took command of a broken army. The 6 new legions were green recruits. The 2 consular legions he inherited were morally shattered, having been humiliated in the field by Spartacus. The Roman army feared its enemy. Spartacus had become a boogeyman to the common legionary. Crassus, a student of history and psychology, knew he could not defeat Spartacus with soldiers who feared the enemy more than their own general. He needed to break that fear and forge a new one, and he would do so with terror. The opportunity arose almost immediately. Crassus sent his legate lieutenant, Mummius, with 2 legions to maneuver behind Spartacus, with strict orders to unlenitioned, unearth rebel army. But Mummius, like the consuls before him, saw a chance for personal glory. At a moment he deemed opportune, he disobeyed direct orders and attacked. Spartacus, the veteran of a dozen such battles, turned and crushed Mummius's legions. It was another humiliating defeat. The Roman soldiers threw down their weapons and fled in panic. When Mummius and the terrified survivors returned to the main camp, Crassus did not welcome them with kindness. He greeted them with icy fury. He rallied the army and announced that he would restore an ancient and feared form of punishment, not used for generations, the tithing decimation. From the cohorts that had fled, he selected 500 of the worst offenders. He divided them into 50 groups of 10 men. Each group drew lots. The unlucky soldier in each group was then beaten to death by his own 9 comrades. The act was a psychological brutality of genius. The 450 men who survived were forced to kill their comrades in arms. The rest of the army was forced to watch. The message was unequivocal. Cowardice is death. To flee from the enemy is death. But if you flee, your death will come not by the sword of a slave, but by the hands of your friends in disgrace. Plutarch wrote that from that day on, Crassus proved himself more dangerous to his own soldiers than the enemy. Spartacus's fear was replaced by Crassus's abject terror. Discipline was restored. The broken army was now a sharp weapon, ready to be used. With his 8-legion army now forged by fear and discipline, Crassus began the hunt in earnest. Spartacus, after his inexplicable decision to march south, continued his journey to the end of the peninsula, reaching the region of Bruttium, the toe of the boot of Italy, modern-day Calabria. Spartacus' strategy finally became clear. He was no longer trying to escape across the Alps, nor to march on Rome. He had a new plan, one that was strategically brilliant. He would march on Sicily. Sicily was Rome's breadbasket, but more importantly, it was a social powder keg. The island had been the site of the first 2 great Servile wars. The slave population in the Vasilatafundiath Sicilian population was massive and oppressed, and the memory of the rebellion was still fresh. If Spartacus, the invincible hero, could transport his veteran army across the Strait of Messina, he could spark a new revolt that could potentially cripple Rome permanently by cutting off its grain supply. Crassus, now in close pursuit, realized Spartacus's intention. He could not allow the rebel leader to reach Sicily. What followed was a stampede. Crassus's legions, now driven by fear of their commander, marched at a relentless pace. Spartacus was in Bruttium, trying to secure the crossing, but Crassus, with his superior logistics, was able to maneuver his forces. He did not attack Spartacus head-on. That would have been too risky, even with his disciplined army. Instead, he used geography against him. The Bruttium region is a peninsula within a peninsula. Spartacus had marched his massive army into a geographic dead end. Crassus saw his opportunity. He didn't need to defeat Spartacus in battle. He needed only to trap him. He positioned his legions across the isthmus, the narrow stretch of land that connected Bruttium to the rest of Italy. Spartacus's army was now trapped. The sea was on one side, the impassable mountains on the other, and Crassus's 8 legions were guarding the only exit. The trap was set. With Spartacus trapped in the southern tip of Italy, Crassus began one of the most impressive feats of military engineering in Roman history, one that would rival Caesar's siege of Alesia. He decided to transform the geographical trap into a physical prison. His plan was to build a wall from coast to coast across the isthmus of Bruttium, completely sealing off Spartacus's army. It was a siege, not of a city, but of an entire army and an entire region. The scale of the undertaking was titanic. The legions, now proving their newfound discipline, traded their swords for shovels. Under the supervision of Crassus's military engineers, tens of thousands of legionaries began digging. Plutarch gives us the dimensions. They dug a moat over 300 stadia, long almost 60 kilometers, that stretched from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Ionian Sea. The moat was reportedly 15 feet, about 4.5 meters deep, and 15 feet wide. Behind this colossal moat, they erected a wooden palisade, an equally long wall of sharpened stakes. It was a work of incredible speed and brutality. Crassus's soldiers worked day and night, while skirmishers and cavalry repelled the desperate attacks of the rebels who tried to disrupt the construction. Spartacus must have watched with growing horror as, day after day, the wall extended and the cage closed. The winter of 72 to 71 BC was approaching. Crassus's plan was simple and ruthless: starvation. Spartacus's army, now numbering over 100,000, including camp followers, was trapped on a peninsula that had already been extensively plundered. Supplies were running low. Glabro's siege of Vesuvius had been an amateur tactic. It was the same strategy, executed with the scale, resources, and ruthlessness of Rome at its peak. The rebel army was now on a countdown to annihilation, trapped between Crassus's steel and the sea. If you're impressed by the scale of this ancient engineering, and the sheer tension of the siege. Be sure to subscribe to the channel, because the impossible escape that follows is one of the most incredible moments in history. Trapped behind Crassus's wall, with winter approaching and starvation becoming a daily reality in the camp, Spartacus turned to his last and only hope, the sea. His original plan to invade Sicily was still viable, if only he could cross the Strait of Messina. He didn't have a fleet, but there was one power in the region that did: the pirates of Cilicia. At that time, the Mediterranean was not a Roman lake. It was the domain of independent pirate fleets, primarily from Cilicia on the southern coast of modern-day Turkey, who operated with impunity, plundering grain ships, kidnapping Roman nobles for ransom, and acting as the mercenary navy of the ancient world. They had no loyalty to Rome. Their only loyalty was to gold. Spartacus, who had amassed a vast fortune by plundering Italy's richest villas, entered into negotiations with them. Historical sources, such as Plutarch and Florus, report that a deal was struck. Spartacus offered the pirates an exorbitant sum to use their ships to transport his army, or at least an advance contingent of a few thousand men across the strait to Sicily. It was a desperate but logical gamble. If he could land his veteran force in Sicily, the war would resume and Crassus's wall would become irrelevant. The pirates, seeing the gold, accepted the deal. They took the payment, and then they disappeared. The sources agree that the pirates betrayed Spartacus. Whether they were bribed by Crassus, who would certainly have known about the negotiations, or whether they simply decided the deal was too risky and that Spartacus's gold was easy money, we will never know. The fact is, the promised ships never arrived. Spartacus and his starving army waited on the coast, staring at the lights of Sicily, so close, yet now unreachable. This betrayal was the final blow. The last escape route was closed. The plan to invade Sicily was dead. Trapped by land by the most impenetrable wall in Italy, and trapped by treachery at sea, Spartacus had only one option left: to do the impossible and cross Crassus's wall. The pirates' betrayal sealed the fate of the Sicilian plan. Spartacus's army was trapped in Bruttium, with hunger and winter as its daily tormentors, and Crassus's wall as the door to its cell. Crassus, in his headquarters, could afford to wait. But Spartacus was a master of impossible tactics. He had descended Vesuvius with vines. He would cross Crassus's wall with desperation. He waited for his secret weapon, the weather. One night, a violent snowstorm descended on the region. The darkness was total, the wind howled, and the snow blinded the Roman sentries, who huddled for shelter, certain that no army would attempt to move in such conditions. Under the cover of this storm, Spartacus set his final and most horrific plan into action. The first obstacle was the moat, 15 feet deep, 15 feet wide, and stretching for 37 miles. It was impassable. It needed to be filled. Spartacus ordered a portion of his army, the most silent and disciplined, to advance. They carried no siege weapons. They carried wood, branches, earth, and, according to historians Plutarch and Appian, the bodies of their captured Roman prisoners and the cattle they had slaughtered. In a night of horror and brutal engineering, they created a bridge. At a specific point in the moat, they filled it with a macabre mixture until the moat was level enough to be crossed. It was an act of cruelty born of absolute necessity. With the makeshift bridge in place, the army began to cross. One by one, in deathly silence, they passed over the moat, scaled the palisade, and fell into Roman territory. When morning came and the storm passed, Crassus's scouts made the shocking discovery: the cage was empty. The crossing point was there, a mound of earth and death, and Spartacus's army, or at least a third of it, the main fighting force, was gone. Crassus, the richest man in Rome, the general who had built one of the greatest siege engineering feats in history, had been deceived. The 60-kilometer wall, which cost a fortune and months of work, had failed. The war was not over. Rome's nightmare was unleashed again. The escape from Crassus's wall was Spartacus's last great tactical triumph, but it also shattered what little cohesion remained in his army. They had escaped, but they were starving, freezing, and being hunted by a now enraged and humiliated Crassus. The old division, the same one that had led to Crassus's death, resurfaced with deadly force. Once again, it was a faction of Gauls and Germans who had grown impatient with Spartacus's leadership. They were tired of marching, tired of fleeing, and after the audacity of their escape, they felt invincible. Led by two commanders, Gannicus and Castus, They refused to follow Spartacus's plan for a quick retreat. They wanted to fight, they wanted to plunder, and they wanted to prove their strength. The rebel army split for the second and final time. Spartacus, with the bulk of his forces, continued his desperate march, trying to gain distance. Gannicus and Castus, with a substantial army, Plutarch suggests over 12,000 fighters, camped separately near Lake Lucanus or Mount Catena. Crassus, now free of his static wall and in full pursuit, saw his opportunity. He made no mistake in pursuing the main leader, Spartacus, who was swift and tactically superior. Instead, he turned on the smaller, more arrogant target. He fell upon Gannicus and Castus's army with the full force of his legions. The battle was a massacre. The Gaul and German rebels, though incredibly brave, were isolated. They tried to form a turtle-turtle formation, joining their shields in a desperate imitation of Roman tactics. But Crassus's disciplined legions, now veteran and ruthless, surrounded them. The fighting was fierce. Plutarch, who had access to Crassus's reports, makes a remarkable observation. Of the 12,300 rebels killed that day, he reports that only 2 were found with back wounds. The rest died face down in a final act of suicidal defiance. This was Crassus's first major field victory. He had destroyed a significant portion of the enemy army. The news gave Crassus the confidence he needed, but, ironically, it sowed the seeds of panic in Rome, which now feared that Spartacus, even weakened, might march on the city. Crassus was hot on Spartacus's trail, savoring his victory over Gannicus and Castus when he received news from Rome that changed everything. The Senate, in utter panic, had misread the situation. Spartacus's escape from Crassus's wall was seen not as a temporary tactical failure, but as the final proof that Crassus was incompetent. The fact that Spartacus was now loose in southern Italy with his erratic movements led the senators to fear the worst, a renewed attack on Rome. Fear overcame logic, and in their fear, the Senate acted, making a decision that was a direct and profound insult to Marcus Licinius Crassus. They decided that Spartacus's war was too great for one man. The Senate sent urgent dispatches to the Republic's 2 most celebrated generals. The first was to Nahas Pompeius Magnus. Pompey, the great rival of Crassus, Sulla's teenage butcher, had just concluded his brutal campaign in Hispania against Sertorius. He was marching back to Italy with his veteran, undefeated legions. The Senate ordered him to divert south to help end the war. The second dispatch was to Marcus Terentius Vero Lucullus, the governor of Macedonia, not to be confused with his more famous brother who was fighting against Mithridates. Lucullus had just landed at Brundisium Brindisi, in the heel of Italy, with his own victorious legions. For Crassus, this news was catastrophic. This was the war. He had financed it. He had commanded it. He had used decimation to forge the army. And now, at the very moment he had the enemy weakened and cornered, his political rivals were being called in to steal his glory, Pompey in particular. Pompey, the darling of the Senate, who always seemed to arrive at the end of a war to deliver the coup de grace and take the credit. The war against Spartacus, for Crassus, was instantly transformed. It was no longer a military campaign to save the Republic. It was a desperate race against time to secure his legacy. Hanid destroyed Spartacus single-handedly before Pompey arrived. Pompey's shadow now loomed over Crassus more menacingly than Spartacus's. Each day's march brought Pompey closer to the north and Lucullus to the east. Crassus' strategy shifted from containment to total and immediate annihilation. He could no longer afford to maneuver, to encircle, or to wear down Spartacus. He needed a pitched battle, a decisive victory, and he needed it. Now he pushed his legions to the limit of human endurance, marching day and night in pursuit of Spartacus, who was also in a desperate situation. Spartacus, now aware of the approaching armies, was trapped in a giant vice. He could not go north, as Pompey was blockading the Alps. He could not march to Brundisium to try to escape by sea, as Lucullus was there. He could only retreat before Crassus. Italy had become a death trap. It was in this moment of mutual desperation that the historian Appian recounts a fascinating, though unproven, detail. Spartacus attempted to negotiate. Seeing the futility of his position, cornered by 3 Roman armies, he supposedly sent messengers to Crassus, offering terms of surrender, perhaps in exchange for his life and those of his men. Crassus, who could have accepted a surrender to end the war, refused with contempt. Surrender was not enough. Surrender would not give him the bloody military triumph he needed to overshadow Pompey's arrival. He needed a victory, not a settlement. To force the battle, Crassus increased the pressure. He sent his lieutenants Quintus and the quaestor Scrofa to attack the flanks of Spartacus's retreating army. The tactic was to tease the rebel leader, anger him, and force him to stop running and fight, and it worked. Spartacus, in a final flash of tactical genius, unexpectedly turned and attacked Scrofa's pursuing forces. The Roman legion, taken by surprise, broke and fled, with Scrofa wounded and barely escaping with his life. It was Spartacus's last victory, but it was a hollow victory. It didn't change the strategic situation. It merely delayed the inevitable for a few days and, perhaps, boosted his men's morale enough to convince them they could win the final battle. Spartacus knew he could run no further. The only course was to stop and fight. The end of the line arrived in Apulia, or on the edge of Lucania, near the headwaters of the Silurius River today, the Seal River. Geography no longer offered refuge. Pompey was approaching from the north. Lucullus had landed at Brundisium, and Crassus, with his 8 bloodthirsty legions, was close behind. Spartacus stopped marching. He had chosen his ground, or perhaps he simply could not run any longer. He turned to face the man who hunted him relentlessly. Spartacus's army was in tatters. Months of flight, starvation during the siege of Bruttius, and the loss of Gannicus and Castus's contingent had weakened it. But now they would fight not for escape, but for survival, with the desperation of cornered men. Crassus, elated at finally having his enemy where he wanted him, eager to end the war before Pompey could claim any part of it, ordered his legions to encamp and build the standard fortifications for the night. His officers, noticing the rebels' desperate disposition, urged him to attack immediately. But Crassus, now a cautious general, wanted a battle on his terms, with his legions rested. It was Spartacus who forced the action. His men, fearing that Crassus was building another wall to encircle them, began attacking the legionaries digging the trenches. The skirmish escalated into a full-blown brawl, and soon, both sides were drawn into an all-out battle neither general had planned for at that moment. The armies clashed. On one side, Crassus's 8 legions, the most disciplined and lethal war machine in the world. On the other, a desperate horde of tens of thousands led by a tactical genius. It was at this moment, as the battle lines were being formed, that Spartacus performed his most legendary act. Seeing that the final battle had arrived, he called for his horse. When it was brought to him, he drew his sword, killed the animal, and declared that if he won, he would have many horses, and if he lost, he would need none. He would fight on foot like his men. The signal was given. It was victory or death. The Battle of the Silurius River had begun. The Battle of the Silurius River was not a display of tactics. It was an act of annihilation. The lines clashed with a ferocity that shocked even Crassus's veteran legionaries. The rebel army, knowing there was no escape, fought with the force of desperation. But Crassus's army fought with the discipline of terror imposed by their general. It was discipline against desperation, and discipline always wins. Crassus's cavalry, superior in numbers and equipment, attacked the flanks of the rebel horde, doubling the lines, while the infantry center advanced methodically, an impenetrable wall of shields and short swords. The carnage was indescribable. Appian reports that the rebels died in such vast numbers that it was impossible to count them. And at the center of this inferno was Spartacus. Having killed his horse, he was fighting on foot on the front lines, like a common soldier. But his goal wasn't survival, it was revenge. He had a single target, Marcus Licinius Crassus. Plutarch, drawing on eyewitness accounts, paints a vivid portrait of his final moments. Spartacus wasn't just fighting, he was hunting. He fought his way through the chaos, running straight toward Crassus, through a shower of weapons and wounded. He cut his way through soldiers and centurions. Sources say he cut down 2 centurions who tried to stop him from reaching the general. He was approaching his target, one man against an army, when a spear struck him. The account says the spear pierced his thigh, forcing him to his knees, but he did not fall. Kneeling, he would have used his shield for support and continued to fight. He was a whirlwind of steel, even on one knee, slaughtering Romans all around him. It was an end that belonged more to mythology than history, but the tide of legionaries was relentless. His own men, who protected him, were killed all around him. Finally, surrounded by enemies, Spartacus was overwhelmed, not by a single heroic blow, but by dozens. He was stabbed, slashed, and pierced by spears until he finally fell. He disappeared beneath a mass of advancing legionaries, eager to kill the man who had humiliated Rome. When the battle ended and the slaughter subsided, Crassus, now the undisputed victor, gave the order to find the body of his enemy. He wanted proof. But despite a thorough search among the tens of thousands of dead, Spartacus's body was never found. He died anonymously, his body indistinguishable from the thousands of slaves who died with him. In his death, he achieved what Rome had always denied him in life. He was not property. He was not a trophy. He was simply free. Crassus's victory at the Silurium River was total. The rebel army ceased to exist. The greatest threat to the Republic in a century was over. Crassus had won. But the ink had barely dried on the report of his victory when the news he most feared arrived. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, the young butcher, his great rival, had arrived from the north. Pompey, marching south with his veteran legions from Hispania, did not arrive in time for the final battle. Glory, it seemed, would belong entirely to Crassus. However, fate gave Pompey a gift. About 5,000 rebels, the fractured remnants of Spartacus's army, managed to escape the massacre at the Silurium and fled north in a desperate attempt to cross the Alps, as Spartacus had originally planned. They ran straight into Pompey's legions. What followed was not a battle, it was a mass execution. The fugitives, exhausted, demoralized, and disorganized, were easily hunted down and slaughtered by Pompey's cavalry. Not one escaped. Pompey, who had not risked a single man against Spartacus's main army, who had not faced the rebel leader's tactical genius for even a day, saw his political opportunity. He immediately sent a dispatch to the Senate. In his letter, he gave Crassus no credit. Instead, he wrote the infamous line that would define the rivalry between the two men for decades. Crassus indeed defeated the slaves in a pitched battle, but I have uprooted the war. For Crassus, it was the final insult. He had financed the war, disciplined the army, hunted Spartacus for months, and destroyed his army in a brutal battle that cost thousands of Roman lives. Pompey had simply stumbled upon the survivors. However, in Rome, public opinion and the Senate, already adoring Pompey, accepted his version. Pompey was hailed as the man who struck the blow, final and decisive, ensuring that the infection would not spread. Crassus had won the war, but Pompey was stealing the triumph. This act of political credit theft poised the relationship between the two most powerful men in Rome and sowed the seeds of distrust that, ironically, would force them to unite, along with Julius Caesar in the First Triumvirate. Spartacus's shadow, even in death, was now shaping the future of the Republic itself. Pompey's purge had killed the fugitives, but Crassus still had 6,000 prisoners captured alive at the Battle of the Silurium River. The war was over. The threat was neutralized. Standard procedure would be to sell these prisoners back into slavery or use them in the next games. But Crassus wasn't interested in standard procedure. He was furious. He was furious with Pompey for stealing his glory, and he was determined to ensure that his name, not Pompey's, would forever be associated with the end of this war. He needed a final act, a statement so powerful and so terrible that no one would ever forget who truly crushed the revolt. He decided to make an example, not just for the slaves of Italy, but for the Senate itself. He gave the order: the 6,000 survivors would be crucified. But they would not be crucified in an isolated field. They would be crucified along the Republic's most important and symbolic road, the Appian Way, the road that connected Rome directly to Capua, the very spot where the rebellion had begun. Roman engineering was put to the service of terror. 6,000 wooden crosses were erected, spaced at regular intervals, along more than 200 kilometers, 130 Roman miles of road. From Capua to the gates of Rome, the travelers were forced to pass through an avenue of death. It was not a quick execution. Crucifixion was designed to be the apex of agony, a slow death that could take days, inflicted by asphyxiation, dehydration, and shock. For weeks, perhaps months, the Appian Way was a corridor of screams and the smell of death. It was the servile punishment, slave punishment, on its most industrial and terrifying scale. Crassus' message was unequivocal. To the slaves of Italy, he said, "This is the price of your dreams. Look what happens to those who defy Rome." To the Roman aristocracy in Pompey, he said, "This is what I did. EUI, restored order.eu. I cleaned up this mess." Ironically, Pompey received a triumph for his victories in Hispania. while Crassus received only iovation, a lesser celebration, because his victory was over unworthy enemies like slaves. But Crassus's ovation, as he marched toward Rome, was punctuated by his macabre masterpiece. The Avenue of 6,000 Crosses was Crassus's true triumph, a brutal and unforgettable monument to his power and cruelty. The story of Spartacus the man ended at the Silurius River, his body lost on the battlefield. The story of his rebellion ended on the Appian Way, with 6,000 rotting bodies as a warning. But then Spartacus's history was just beginning. In the centuries that followed, Roman historians would use him as an example of what happens when order is challenged. But it was modern philosophers and revolutionaries who resurrected him, not as a villain, but as a hero. For Karl Marx, he was the most splendid fellow in all ancient history, a true representative of the proletariat fighting against its oppressors. For the French revolutionaries, and later for the civil rights movement, his name became a global synonym for the struggle for freedom. Yet no cultural legacy is more powerful than the scene immortalized in Stanley Kubrick's 1960 film. The scene is pure fiction. It's not in Plutarch or Appian. In the film, after their defeat, the Romans demand that the survivors identify their leader, promising them clemency in exchange for the crucifixion of only Spartacus. As Spartacus, played by Kirk Douglas, is about to stand and sacrifice himself, the man beside him stands and shouts, "I am Spartacus." Then another stands, and another, until the entire army of captured slaves stands, each claiming the identity of their leader, choosing crucifixion and solidarity rather than life in exchange for betrayal. It is one of the most powerful moments in cinematic history. Why is this scene, which never happened, so crucial to his legacy? Because it captures Thetra, the rebellion, in a way that historical facts cannot. The real Spartacus may have been a pragmatic leader trying to lead his people home. But the Dido Spartacus, what he became, is the symbol that dignity cannot be crushed. The I am Spartacus scene transforms military failure into a moral triumph. It says that while Crassus could kill the man and crucify the army, he could not kill the idea. By claiming his name, the fictional slaves proved that Spartacus's identity belonged not to an individual, but to all who fight against oppression. The rebellion failed, but the revolt became immortal. Spartacus's legacy is not what he did, but what he represents. The Spartan War was over, but its political shockwaves were only beginning to reshape Rome. In the immediate aftermath, both Crassus and Pompey marched their armies to the gates of Rome. Neither was willing to dismiss their legions. Pompey demanded a triumph for his victories in Hispania and his cleansing of slaves. Crassus demanded his ovation and, more importantly, the position of consul. Roman law prohibited Pompey from running. He was too young and had not risen through the standard political ranks. But Pompey, encamped with a victorious army outside the city, made an offer the Senate could not refuse. The result was the tense and unprecedented consulship of 70 BC. Rome's two greatest rivals, Crassus and Pompey, were forced to rule together. The man who won the war and the man who stole the credit for it had to sit side by side in the forum, this joint consulship. Born of mutual fear and shared ambition, further shattered the norms of the Republic. They used their power to reverse many of Sulla's aristocratic reforms, restoring the power of the plebeian tribunes in an attempt to win popular favor. This was the first crucial step that led, a decade later, to the formal alliance between Crassus, Pompey, and a rising young politician named Julius Caesar, the First Triumvirate, which would effectively seal the fate of the Republic. What about slavery, the root cause of the war? Spartacus's revolt changed everything, but not in the way one might expect. There was no abolition, not even humanitarian reform. Instead, change came from fear. The Roman elite had stared into the abyss. They had seen what their talking tool was capable of. After the war, landowners slowly began to change their practices. There was a gradual decrease in the reliance on armies of slaves chained to felito fundient, an increase in the use of free tenant settlers. Conditions for some domestic slaves may have improved slightly, and manumission slave liberation became more frequent, not out of kindness, but as a safety valve to release pressure. Spartacus's war did not free Rome's slaves, but it forced Rome for the first time to recognize the dangerous humanity of those it held captive. Fear, it seems, was a more effective teacher than morality.